Hello, and welcome to the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America's California Virtual Book Fair and our special program, Well Versed, a conversation on reading, writing, and collecting rare books. My name is Brad Johnson, and I'm the president of the ABA, as well as a member of the committee who helped organize this event. For those of you who are not aware, the ABA was founded in 1949 to promote interest in rare and antiquarian books and book collecting, and to foster collegial relations among booksellers. We strive to maintain the highest standards in the trade, and all of our members agree to abide by the stringent ABA Code of Ethics. Following this program, we hope that you will consider visiting the California Virtual Book Fair at abaa.org/VBF. It will be open continuously until 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Saturday, March 6th. I just have a few housekeeping issues before we get on with the program. We are recording this session and it will be available for later viewing on the ABA's YouTube channel. And this session is also streaming live on Facebook. If you have questions, we encourage you to move your cursor to the bottom of the screen and write your question in the Q&A section. My co-host today, Eloisa Mesqua, will help us with those questions at the end of this session. If you would like to share a comment with all in attendance, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And now I'm going to introduce my co-host, who's going to in turn introduce our first featured guest. So Eloisa Mesqua is the ABA's assistant director and as well as a published poet herself. Her debut collection, From the Inside Quietly, is the inaugural winner of the Shelter Belt Poetry Prize selected by Ada Limon. A MacDowell Fellow, her second collection of poems, Fighting is Like a Wife, is forthcoming from Coffee House Press in the spring of 2022. So take it away, Eloisa.
Thank you so much, Brad. I am very excited to be introducing a poet who's actually, I think the first person I knew was a poet laureate of a state. Like I didn't know that was a thing until I heard of Dana Gioia. So Dana is a former poet laureate of California and author of 5 collections of poetry, including Interrogations at Noon, which won the American Book Award. Gioia also served as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 to 2009. So thank you so much for being here, Dana.
Glad to be here.
And our second featured guest is Ernest Helbert, my good friend and fellow metalhead. He's an American poet, critic, and opera librettist. He's the author of 60 Sonnets, All of You on the Good Earth, Caligulin, selected as winner of the 2017 Poets Prize, and Last One Out. He lives in the great city of Philadelphia, where he works as a rare book dealer at Bauman Rare Books. And he writes about book culture and the history for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. So welcome, Ernie. Oh. We need you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
And with that, take it away, gentlemen.
Okay. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for asking me. You know, I wrote a profile of Dana Gioia as a collector and also as a poet and a critic and all the things he's done for Fine Books and Collections magazine. I believe that was fall of 2019. You know, and so we've already talked about a lot of these things, and I thought it's best to begin at the beginning. And I just wanted to ask you, Dana, do you have some recollections of books in the house when you were growing up?
Well, I had a very unusual childhood because even though I was a working class kid raised in a small apartment, the rooms of the apartment were full of books, highly intellectual books on art, literature, and music from my uncle, who at that point was dead, who had been a sort of working class intellectual merchant marine. And so I was raised surrounded by books that my parents didn't read, but they wanted to keep as a kind of shrine, I guess, to my mother's brother. And that gave me a different orientation. I've been reading as long as I can remember. I've been reading everything. We had a huge public library, and books have been probably as much as anything else in my life what led me to the next stage in my life, what opened up the horizons for me. I began reading for pleasure, and to this day, even though I'm a quote unquote professional man of letters, I still read entirely for pleasure. If I don't like the book, I find it almost impossible to finish. My first great love affair was with Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I still have a lot of the paperback Ace editions of it that I bought when I was 10, 11, or 12. But
So what are some of the other authors that stand out for you, from the earliest days? You mentioned Burroughs, and what are some others along those lines who sort of enticed you because they were exciting and fun, as opposed to something that you thought maybe you were supposed to read or was marked down as great literature?
Well, when I was a kid, there was still a sort of a boys' book culture. I mean, there were books that boys read that their mothers didn't want them to read, that the teachers really disapproved of. And science fiction, fantasy, adventure. I mean, an author who brought particular horror to any adult was H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh yeah.
Who we had to get old editions from libraries and things like that because he was essentially out of print. But Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, H.P. Lovecraft, Arthur Conan Doyle, not so much the Sherlock Holmes, but the Professor Challenger books, The Lost World, when the world screams, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne. And so my friends and I'm talking about when we were in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, would read the books, we'd talk about them on the playground, or we'd talk about them after school. And that was my best and most lasting introduction to literary criticism, which is to say, engaged readers talking about books they liked or they didn't like, and we would argue endlessly about, what was the best Edgar Rice, Burroughs novel. Of course, it's The Princess of Mars, but we would, and it was interesting because it would, in a very natural way, it refined our judgment. And, I was reading years ago, I came across something that Jorge Luis Borges said, which was, he goes, I think of myself primarily as a reader, and then secondarily as a poet, and then sort of on the fringes of his identity, somebody who wrote short stories. And I said, that's sort of me. I'm a writer, but I think of myself still primarily as a reader, someone who loves books, loves what's in books, and discovering an author for me is as exciting as discovering a foreign city. I can remember where I was and what I was doing when I first read Weldon Keys. When I first read Aldous Huxley and things like this. These were moments in my life where my life sort of forked into new possibilities. I imagine it must be fairly much the same for you, Ernie, isn't it?
I mean, it's interesting. My father was working class. His father was a factory worker, and there were no books in his house growing up. And he was a public high school teacher, and he filled our house ceiling to floor with books. He loved books since they were always around. I can sympathize with you with the H.P. Lovecraft. We live in this era of ABE and the ABAA and what have you. But finding H.P. Lovecraft was not easy, and Arkham House continued up until maybe 10 years ago to continue putting things out. So in the 80s, when I was getting interested in this in junior high and high school, I remember I was reading an issue of Twilight Zone magazine, and in the back you have these little ads, and Arkham House had a little ad, and it was Mountains of Madness and Other Tales, and also the Dunwich Horror and Other Tales. And I went to my dad and I said, this is great. I'd really love to, it's a PO box. You're not going to find this this is before the big box stores as well. So there's no it was just Walden Books, B. Dalton, maybe some small local stores. You send a check for $20 to a PO box somewhere, and then the book turns up a month later. And I would just sit up all night reading these books.
We had a book, and I don't know if you read this. It was, I'm just about, almost a generation older than you, Ernie. And it was a book by Auguste Deleuze called Who Knocks?
Yeah.
And there was one copy of that in the Los Angeles Public Library system. And my friends and I were always requesting it. So whoever had that book, it was like having a drug or something like that. It had a kind of evil allure that you gained by having that. And but those books were formative, as were these things like, and it's really funny when I talk to filmmakers, I talked to artists, I talked to writers from California. Almost all of us read Famous Monsters of Filmland.
Yeah.
And Forrest Jack Ackerman's book, It Magazine. But those things brought us into literature. Brought us, I read this novel by Thea von Braun, Metropolis, which was the novelization of Fritz Lang's, film. And by reading Ray Bradbury, I began reading Aldous Huxley. But by reading Huxley, I began reading Evil Lenoir, all the way into, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Faulkner. And there was a kind of a natural continuity in the same way as reading brought me into writing. I wanted to emulate the things that I loved. But we haven't talked about poetry, which is a different sort of thing. But I think you and I began reading out of pleasure and wonder. And that sort of typifies still the work that I like. I've got to get a jolt of pleasure, and I have to be fascinated by it, the vision of it, the language of it, the philosophy behind it. Right now I'm reading a new translation of Goethe's Faust by Frederick Turner, which is really good. It's this impossible, classic that doesn't translate very easily into English. But anyway, as you can see, my childhood passion turned into an adult vice.
Right.
And, I've got 6,000 books in this room. This room is almost entirely poetry, criticism, musicology, and a little bit of and anthologies. Mm-hmm. The fiction is in the house.
I have 3,000 books in the basement that we finished here. We have a house in West Philadelphia. It was built before 1900, so it's sturdy. But I've got another probably 1,000 or 2,000 on the next 2 floors, including this room. You can't see it, it's over here. My wife works in a museum where she's very keenly aware of load-bearing qualities of different storage areas. I mean, she works in a museum where they have items that weigh a ton or more, all the way down to tiny little sherds. Yeah. And she's a little worried about my load-bearing capacities here on this floor right now. But I remembered just while we were talking about it, where do books come from before the age where we have so much access to books? I remember I was washing dishes in a German restaurant on Oxford Avenue in Northeast Philadelphia. And one day it was a little slow. They told me to go clean out the garage behind and I start throwing stuff in the dumpster, and I was cleaning it out. They wanted to stick a car in there. And I found this box of books up in the rafters, and I would sit down and start reading. And I said, can I have these books? They're like, yeah, of course, throw them out or keep them. We don't care. And I started reading them. I still have those. That was Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, Armies of the Night by Norman Mailer. And I was reading these. I couldn't wait to get on the bus to go home because I could start reading them on the bus again. I have all these, still. So I get books from all sorts of places. So I want to ask, where do you get your books?
Well, I mostly got my books when I was a kid at drugstores when they had these racks and selling them. But almost immediately I discovered this thing called the used bookstore. And I haunted used bookstores. And in fact, some of the people who are my closest friends in lives are people I met in bookstores. Yeah. There was River Run Books in Hastings on Hudson. Mm-hmm. Frank Sosha, became almost like an kind of like foster father for me. Right. Chimera Books that was in Palo Alto. Above it was a little thing being created that I think they called Google. It ate Chimera Books and everything else in the neighborhood eventually. Serendipity, in Berkeley. This kind of strange loft called Gramercy Park Books that were run by these strange couple, back in the 70s. And these were people I enjoyed. There's a borderline between madness and genius that one sees in booksellers, which are kind of my kind of people. It's sort of my tribe. And so, Chimera Books, or especially River Run, I would go there on a Saturday. I would sit down. Frank would say, I got this book. I think it might interest you. We talked. All these other people came in, and it was a sort of literary club. And I want to say something that I think is not really sufficiently acknowledged by writers, by critics, certainly, but not by academics, which is that bookstores, booksellers are really one of the foundations of literary culture.
Yes.
You know, that's where readers meet, not students, but readers of all ages, of all classes. And the bookseller, if the book, you know, seller, who, if he's any good, becomes a kind of professor, you know, and, you know, he or she guides readers, you know, to the next possible door that they might enter in. And they also provide a kind of community. You meet other people there. Michael Palma, who I ended up co-editing New Italian Poets, who's right now finishing his translation of Dante's Paradiso, I met in River Run. Robert McPhillips, a critic who ended up writing maybe the best thing ever written about my work, you know, I met in Gotham Book Mart. I heard a guy at the cash register saying, "I'd like to buy a copy of Dana Gioia's new book." And I said, "Who is this enlightened man?" And I started talking to him, and he says, you know, we started talking. We became friends. And so I sorely miss bookstores as you know, part of my my kind of steady rhythm of life. You know, Second Story Books in Washington was very important for me, and that's why these book fairs, even the virtual book fairs, and that's why, you know, when I came back to the West Coast, I joined the Roxburgh and I joined the Zamorano Club, because the collegiality of these organizations are wonderful.
Yeah, you know, I have I'm lucky to have two very good used bookstores within 100 yards of my son's daycare, which I can sneak over to once in a while. There's a Room of One's Own and The Last Word, and they're both very good in very different ways, as bookstores are. And I love haunting those places and talking to people. And it's really something I don't go very often because of the situation we're in. And I really miss going to bookstores. I miss going to book fairs and seeing people.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you also about your libraries. How do you, I mean, not that one should use a library, but historically people used their own libraries as well as, you know, public and private ones. How do you use your library?
Well, see, this is an excuse that I give myself for having this many books. And I think it's a pretty good excuse, is that, you know, I have supported myself and my family for the last 30 years as a writer. But because of where I live and the schedule I keep, I don't really have access to a good university library, even a decent college library. Sad to say, even when I was at USC, the library there was not really very, very adequate. So with what you're seeing behind you is a working library of a poet, a critic, an anthologist. I mean, I've got 3 desks in this room. That way, when I collaborate with other editors or writers or even composers, you know, we each have a place to work at. And so I have a really good, you know, one of that whole shelves back there is bibliographies. Behind me is poetry in Latin, in Italian, in German, in French, which are the languages I read with the most ease. I've got probably, I don't know, 4,000 books of poetry in English here. I've got books on prosody. So I can put together an essay, an anthology, largely through the resources of my own library, which I supplement with books I order. I just finished a 14,000 word essay on Charles Baudelaire. And so, you know, I bought about probably 20 books on Baudelaire from various book dealers around the country. So, you know, that were highly, you know, relatively specialized volumes so I could write the piece. So this is a working library. And then within the working library is a completely extravagant, indulgent library of very expensive books by writers that I love. And you know, because you led me down the primrose path a couple of weeks ago by telling me about an auction in Ohio, where indeed, you know, I bought this signed first edition of Robinson Jeffers' first selected poems. And much more interestingly, this copy of the poet Weldon Keys's first book, The Last Man, which is Weldon Keys's own copy.
That's great.
And so, and I've written a lot on Weldon Keys, and so I love having these books because they deepen my emotional and even intellectual connection, I think, with these writers.
Oh yeah, yes. There's definitely a magical quality to having those. So I think we
Absolutely.
have.
The autograph itself has a magical quality, I think.
Oh, there's no question about it. It definitely has an aura.
It's like a saint's relic. You know, this is the
You know,
thigh bone of Saint Ambrosius. You know,
I know
it has
that
miraculous qualities.
I extrapolated from that very sort of notion. The Rosenbach is on here. I see them over here on the chat. I gave a talk at the Rosenbach a few years ago about literary relics and the notion of touching something that was touched by, or even a body part of, not just hair.
Yeah.
I was looking at auction this morning that's coming up. There's a lock of Richard Brautigan's hair coming up, or maybe, no, that wasn't an auction. Actually, someone's got it for sale at the here at the fair. So these relics are very real, and people value these and cherish them. And so yeah, no, there's something to that.
You know, I just finished rereading the biography of Rosenbach. You know, so wonderful. I mean, it's a book. It's better the second time, I think, because you can keep track of the details more. But my mother, was Mexican Catholic, and she had a little bottle of Lord's water. And if we were particularly ill, she'd sprinkle a little Lord's water on us. And so, I was raised with the notion of the miraculous, and so, so I think it's transferred to my book collection.
That's great. So we're talking about Dana's collection, and Brad, you're there somewhere. I believe you have some images of Dana's library. Can you show those? I'm not really sure how this works, so forgive me for.
Well, you can.
Oh, and I see some interesting comments in the chat. Okay. Nope, that's a picture.
That's
from, okay. Well, we have a little bit of a competition. That's from my wall. I have three portraits of, okay, we're going to go backwards. Never mind. So there's some of Dana's books.
Yeah, this is the room I'm in from the other angle. And this is, I thought it would be introduced as just my Auden collection, on one side, and these are just, just some of the nicer poetry books that I, keep in a way that they don't get any sun on them. But you can see Elizabeth Bishop, Robert Fitzgerald, Everson, Donald Davy, who was my teacher, Randall Jarrell, Anthony Hecht, Seamus Heaney, Richard Wilbur. These are poets that I love, and for most of them, I pretty much have a copy of every book they've published. And I just about 2 months ago, I bought a copy of Richard Wilbur's first book that was inscribed by Wilbur to another poet I know, Radcliffe Squires, a somewhat forgotten poet, but a wonderful poet. And I may be the only person in the world who wants a book inscribed to Radcliffe Squires, but for me, it was delightful because I esteem Squires' poetry immensely, even though he is forgotten. But you and I share a passion for Auden.
We do, absolutely, and that's the later Auden. So I wanted to show some of my Audens. I have on the right here is Lottie Jacobi's. On the left, okay, so that is, let me see here. So what we have there on the, if everyone's seeing the same thing I'm seeing, the one where he's looking down at the book. Okay, so that's Lottie Jacobi, 1946. That's a silver gelatin print. It's not the original. We have the original in stock at Bowman Rare Books, signed by her. That's a scan I have of that on my wall. And then I have the Richard Avedon one of him in the snow in New York on the other side of the room. So that's a Richard Avedon one from 1960, a little bit later. He's starting to look a little bit more like the one you see in Dana's library. Auden once remarked that his face looked like a wedding cake left out overnight in the rain. But I have these ones of him when he's younger. I have one more, there it is. That's the Irving pen, which is 1947. That's a bromide print. It's just a scan. These are not originals.
Yeah.
And so, I keep thinking someday I'll write an essay called 3 Portraits of Auden when I find the time of the ones I have. But yeah, Dana and I are both huge fans of Auden because he brings together so many elements, not only just being a prodigy of verse craft and the entire sort of Saintsbury worth history of prosody in English, where he sort of does everything, and he does it with great facility. He's an intellectual with big ideas, speaking to his age and to all ages, but also with a fine sense of humor and nuance and playfulness on a very small level. And so I think that he's kind of a little bit of a test. Like, do you like Auden, or do you find him off-putting, or there's too much of him, or he's boring, or he's too old-fashioned, or do you find him fascinating? And I happen to find him fascinating. I did not when I was younger. I didn't really get the appeal. But when I got older, I just couldn't stop reading him, and now I have portraits of him all over the place. So,
Well, when I was in high school, we were assigned a poem by Auden called "To the Unknown Citizen." And I
yeah.
liked it so much, I went and I bought my first hardbound book of poetry in the May Company department store book section, if you can remember when they had book sections, of Auden's collected poems. And I've been a fan of his ever since. You and I both have written opera libretti. And one of the things that's wonderful about Auden is if you're interested in Auden, it brings you into different things, because he did operas with Benjamin Britten, with Igor Stravinsky, with Hans Werner Henze, with
Yes.
Nicholas Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov's cousin. He collaborated on plays with Christopher Isherwood, which brings you into British, experimental theater. A lot of his individual poems were set to music, so it's really quite interesting, because Auden brings me into a lot of things. He collaborated, with books with all kinds of interesting people, from Lionel Trilling to Louis Cronenberg, Jacques Barsan, in terms of when they were on I think it was called the Reader's Book Club. So it's, Auden kind of brings you into the mid-century world of the arts.
He was also a fairly prolific, if eccentric and occasional critic. I mean, I think the one picture you showed, you have, I've got those as well, the volumes of his collected prose, most of it written for magazines. He didn't usually write it as book length. And things like The Dyer's Hand, Forwards and Afterwards, those are collections of smaller things, but they're very, very interesting examples of literary criticism.
Yeah, with him, I mean, with T.S. Eliot, you feel like he's writing a formal essay. With Auden, you feel like he's just sitting with you in the room talking.
Right.
Another critic, poet I really like, and I'm glad I bought him early, is Phillip Barkin.
Oh,
So
yes.
I've all of Phillip Barkin, who's now, extraordinarily expensive for some of the books. But,
Sure.
it's good. To give you an example, there's a poet, somewhat forgotten poet, a wonderful poet named Elizabeth Jennings. And
Yes. Yeah.
she, unknown in the United States, a couple of years ago, I said, I want to write a long piece about her. And so it gave me an excuse to buy all of her books. So I've got a whole shelf of Elizabeth Jennings. And I love it because, once again, it gives you a sense of mid-century England. In her case, she had a very odd life, because she ended up essentially being a street person. Even though she had a medal from the Queen, and she was taught in all these British schools, she was still living on the streets of Oxford. But I have books of hers that she inscribed to her parents, and I find that very kind of following her career, which with all of its sorrows, it gave me a human connection with her that I think allowed me to write about her better.
Right. Well, one thing I wanted to mention, and we're getting a few questions in the chat, is what's the destiny of these books? I know that you've already made some plans for some things to go into institutional collections. Is that right?
Well, I have just given my papers, which is also a huge amount of correspondence that I've got, both individually, some of the things that I had with the National Endowment for the Arts, with people like Dave Brubeck and Ray Bradbury, to the Huntington Library, which was a library that, even as a kid, Huntington as a gallery and a library was very instrumental in kind of opening up the vistas of my life. And I'm a Californian, and it just seemed to me the best place for them. I gave another archive that I had to my alma mater, Stanford, which is an archive of a press that, for complicated reasons, I ended up owning. But I have a huge library. And so you could say there's 3 libraries that I've got. I've got a huge working library. I've got, a really good, it's as good as any library, a personal library I've seen, of contemporary poetry, contemporary American poetry. And then I have, lack of better words, a modern firsts rare book library, right, with tremendous collections of people like Larkin and Keyes and Auden and Hecht and Wilbur. I would like to give that to an institution, because I feel that so few places have funds to buy literary books now, to really put together a collection. And there is, and I feel this as a student and as a critic, there is no substitute for working with primary materials.
Right.
When you actually see the physical book that was printed, it almost always either changes or refines your opinion. I haven't figured out where I should donate these to. And I have a secret evil reason for doing this, Ernie, and I should confess it to you. Is it get you as a book collector, you get to a point, you know, especially you have kids. My wife and I give a lot of money to charity, and I'll see a book like this that I really want. And I say, I feel bad about buying it. But once I made the decision, I'm going to give this library away, I said, well, this is a kind of charitable deduction, isn't it? You know, I'm not deducting because I don't really deduct them from my taxes, but, you know, this will be something that a student of modern poetry will want to see. So it's given me an excuse to add better books to the library because I intend to give it away. So I've got to figure out in the next 10 years where I place this collection and whether I take the larger collection and give it to the same place as the smaller collection. But, you know, I'd like to create a special collections or improve a special collections for a college or a university somewhere.
Well, I want to say, you know, there's another question, another thing I'm curious about. So, you know, I have a few of the books that are from my childhood. I recently found one that was given to me when I was just a year old from my grandmother. It's Animal Babies, and I discovered it in with all my military history books in my basement. I brought it up to read to my son, and he loves it. But one that I have is like an Ace paperback sort of thing. I don't know if it was Ace, but like a small mass market paperback of Tolkien's The Hobbit that is held together with rubber bands. And I believe my father read it, both my older sisters read it, I read it, and my brother read it. And I still have that. It has zero value, right? In terms of nobody would want it. I cherish it because it's one thing that we all read and we all loved it. What are some of the books, do you have, or let me ask the question, do you have books from your childhood that you still have?
No, I do. I have, actually last night, I was trying to reshelve books last night. I have a bad leg at the moment. I can barely stand up, but I was still reshelving books, you know, such is my compulsion. And I came across about 30 of these Ace paperbacks of Burroughs. But a more interesting book was about a month ago. I was down in Los Angeles staying, you know, we have a house down there that my son lives in. And my wife and I have a lot of our fiction is down there. And I picked up the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen in an edition that both I and my wife had as a child, illustrated by Arthur Schick, who is an illustrator I have come to adore. I have a small collection, or not so small, but, you know, compared to my books collection, of anti-fascist propaganda.
I've seen some
of
of
the
that.
30s and 40s. And Schick is the Rembrandt and Michelangelo of, you know, because he's a displaced European Jew with just a genius, you know, in a sense, for expressing both European culture and sort of Judaica in his art. There was a show in New York last year, which I missed, but which I would have loved to have seen. But I reread the entire, you know, book of Andersen's fairy tales just so I could experience, kind of try to recapture what I felt as a child. I then read the Fritz Kreidel, Aesop, and Grimm's fairy tale.
Well, you did an opera not too long ago based on Grimm's fairy tales.
Yeah, I love Grimm's fairy tales, and I did this thing called with the composer Laurie Laitman, wonderful children's opera called The Three Feathers, which just got done in Singapore right before the pandemic. We were supposed to have another production at the Steamboat Opera outside of Denver, but I hope that'll happen in the future. But I think, you know, once again, it's the wonder and the pleasure of literature that fairy tales and folk tales express, and these wonderful artists that were able to, you know, to sort of capture that in their illustrations. I still love illustrated books.
Yeah. Well, we have a question here asking and saying, fascinating conversation. Thank you for that. Any advice for new rare book collectors? I mean, I would start out by just saying, you know, find something that you really just are really interested in and let it take on a life of its own. If it's an author or a movement or a period, something that you really enjoy, and start, and it's not about, you could buy these things for $1. They don't have to be rare in the sense of being highly valued monetarily necessarily. It's probably best that they're not when you first start out. Follow the trail of what you enjoy and say, I've got this, 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 and this. I still need these 3. And it's something to think about.
Yeah.
And when you do get them, there's an enormous satisfaction. And some people have the collector's bug to the point of compulsion. And then there are people who just don't care about these things. But if you're somewhere in the middle, I find I'm in the middle. It's like, if there's something I already care about, I'm interested enough to keep following that breadcrumb trail, to go back to the Grimm brothers, look for a second, follow the breadcrumb trail. What's the next thing? What's the next logical thing? Did you discover this person wrote a novel that you never realized? Like, I've realized Louis MacNeice wrote a novel. And so I tracked it down and bought it. I didn't even know he wrote a novel for the first 20 years I was reading his poetry. So there's interesting byways you can get into, and that would be my advice: is do what you love. Just follow what you love.
I entirely agree with you, Ernie. I would add one thing, that I think a wonderful place to begin is if there's a writer or a genre or a press or an artist that you like that other people don't seem to like as much.
Mhm.
And that's probably good, because it'll be less expensive, and and in a sense, follow that and make something of it, because it'll give you an entry, and one author leads to another, one genre leads to another, and so, but that gives you an affordable way of beginning. I mean, if you sort of say, I want to collect James Joyce and I want to start with the first edition of Ulysses, well, you're going to have a very slow progress as a book collector, because you'll have to save up. But if you get interested in somebody who's less known, or if you aren't concerned about first editions in the pristine state. But I'll tell you something, and people give me dirty looks when I say this. I do not own a book, no matter how expensive, that I do not read. I don't want a book that is so delicate or precious that I can't pick it up and read it. I bought once again, I wouldn't have bought this book if I didn't think I would eventually be giving it to away. But Jesse Rossa told me he had a copy of San Joaquin.
That's Triolet Books. Triolet Books.
By William Everson. So this is William Everson, Brother Antoninus' second book. It's printed by Ward Ritchie, one of the great saints of Western bookmen and presses. And it's inscribed by Everson to Josephine Miles, a wonderful poet who was almost entirely paralyzed, was in a wheelchair. So I've got a wonderful book in a wonderful edition inscribed, to a fellow poet, and it's, I wouldn't have gotten it if, Jesse hadn't sort of said, this is a book that I think, that Dana would like. And I wouldn't have bought it if I was just buying it for myself.
Right.
And years ago, I met Josephine Miles towards the end of her life, and she sort of raised her hand. I didn't know what she was doing. And then a friend of mine whispered, said, she's trying to shake hands with me. So I took, her sweet, limp hand in hand. And I bent over to her wheelchair and we talked, for a long time. And it was a very, very wonderful moment for me, because I knew her on the page, but I hadn't realized the extent of her disabilities till I met her. And so this links me through Everson, through Ward Ritchie, through California letters to this poet. And I ended up putting her in an anthology, and there was nothing available about her. There was nothing about, where she, when she'd taken her degrees, when she'd retired. And so I had to track down a lot of her posthumously, a lot of her friends to get that information. So it sort of completes a little human circle for me.
Well, these things do dovetail. I mean, the pursuit of a collection is a way of preserving and as well as explaining something that happened and helping other people to learn about it, which is also what a critic can do. What a good critic does often is find something that is neglected, something that's deserves more attention. It's fallen to the wayside. People didn't even know it was there. And this all, of course, dovetails with teaching if you're someone who teaches, but it all comes together in one place, really, if you're someone who does all of these things, which I think is the heart of what we're really talking about here.
Yeah, I saw there's Daniel, Clavitter said that he has one of his favorite books is a book by Anthony Hecht. And
Yes.
I began buying Hecht when nobody else was buying Hecht. I bought a hardbound edition without a dust jacket, admittedly, of his first book for $1.
I have the
And,
first book with the dust jacket, but I had to pay a little bit more than that.
yeah, and so I did 2 years later, but and I and so you could find these things if you get somebody before they become fashionable. I mean, Seamus Heaney, I began buying his books as they came out at the beginning of his career. Once again, it would be hard to afford a lot of the books that I simply bought at face price.
Right. Well, we have someone else asking if you could just talk, and you've addressed this a little bit, so we don't have to do it too much, but just name a few, asking who your favorite poets are. I mean, it's always I find these to be more difficult questions than they seem. Like, say, who's your favorite composer? It's really not that simple, but
Yeah, it's like, I love poetry. I read a lot of poetry. So you ask me who's my favorite poet? Shakespeare. But that's not an answer, I mean,
well, there's that, yeah, Dante.
Shakespeare's good. I mean, I've got a whole wall of Shakespeare, and I read Shakespeare all the time.
Right.
Starting, let's say in the 19th century, John Keats, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I love Alfred Lord Tennyson. I think he's one of the greatest poets in English. Some people, think that's a terrible, terrible judgment on my part, but I really do think that Auden said, he had the best ear in English, and just Tennyson's love poems. Among Americans, I think Robert Frost is the greatest American poet. Probably, maybe shoulder to shoulder with Emily Dickinson. And I love them, but Frost, I love Edwin Arlington Robinson. Robinson's a great poet who wouldn't be hard to collect. He's out of fashion right now. I love Robinson Jeffers. I love Richard Wilbur. I love Weldon Keys. I like the dark suicidal poets, God help me. Right now I'm building my Anne Sexton collection. But Weldon Keys, the moment I sat down and read Weldon Keys, Thomas Mann once said, he's talking about reading Schopenhauer for the first time. He got a book of Schopenhauer, he went out into the garden, and he says, I read as one only reads once or twice in one's life. And that's how I read Keys. I read it, and I was a different person after having read the book.
It's a revelation, yeah.
Yeah, and it just means that you're reading the right book at the right time. So I'd say, look at Weldon Keys, Elizabeth Bishop. When I started reading her, people didn't really read her much. Now she's she's the goddess of American poetry. I mean, so she's good. There's a living poet. There's Kay Ryan. Collect Kay Ryan. Kay Ryan is our Dickinson. Right. A.E. Stallings, is another one.
She's for sale. I saw one of her things here at this fair. Her first book, The Archaic Smile, the Richard Wilbur winner, an inscribed copy, is for sale here at the fair for $200. So
I chose that book for the contest.
There you go.
I spotted her early. But Stallings is a tremendous poet. But Kay Ryan, you could probably collect both of those. They'd be my best. My bets for the best two living American poets, at least of their respective generations.
Right.
You should name some. You should name some favorites.
Oh, geez, there's just, oh my God. It's one of these things that's constantly shifting. But I mean, of course, Larkin and Auden stay the same. I'm rereading Deborah Warren's books right now because I'll be interviewing her for the Newburyport Literary Festival. And I just was rereading Jericho Brown's books. I had the opportunity to read with him years ago, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for the tradition last year. And so it's whatever's like on my nightstand. I mean, I'm looking at like boxes and shelves. I'm constantly pulling things down, rereading things.
I had a couple of the books that I just recently bought. I've been, I'm trying to improve my Gwendolyn Brooks collection. I think Gwendolyn Brooks is really underrated. I mean, people know her because she's in, the children's anthologies, but she's just a really fine poet. So a lovely human being in person too. I was on Poetry Society of America board with her. I did some other, sort of good works with her. But she's Gwendolyn Brooks is another poet, not terribly expensive to collect.
Right. And are we getting into the time? Hi, Louisa, are we getting into are we going into your Q&A time?
Oh, well, this is wonderful. We just
Sorry, okay.
no, this is so great. I'm going to pick two questions from the Q&A for each of you to answer.
Right.
One of them is very practical and the other one is not at all practical. So let's start with the practical one. How do you preserve your books and what preventative measures do you have in place in case of fire, earthquake, floods, etc., especially being in California?
Well, mine's shorter, so I could answer that first and then give the floor to Dana. I mean, I have a poem called Cover to Cover that was in the Los Angeles magazine Rattle. And it starts out by saying, I don't collect them, they just accumulate. Although I have some of these first editions that you've seen of Auden, I've got them double shelved, so definitely no sunlight will hit them. Most of my books are simply not that valuable. I do have a dehumidifier in my basement to keep it dry. I happen to live on a hill, Squirrel Hill, so water tends to flow away from my house. Fire, knock on wood. But as a professional bookseller, what I tell people is that the two killers are, well, three. One is fire, of course, in history. I just reviewed Richard Avenden's book, Burning the Books, for the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago, which is about a history of the destruction of books, intentional as well as unintentional. Fire is a big one. Floods the other big one. Water damage, because they get moldy. Once one book has mold, if it's brought into a room of other books that don't have mold, they may catch it. And so there's that. And then there's, Dana mentioned sunlight, and that's a real killer, especially of dust jackets. What we call toning or fading, where a very colorful dust jacket will sort of turn slowly gray or white as the sun hits it. So all I'm going to say, since my books are not that valuable, is dehumidifier is good in any place where there might be that. Keep them out of direct sunlight, and hopefully no fires, and good luck, everyone.
Well, let me start off by a cautionary tale. 2 years ago, October of 2019, I was called by my neighbor at 2 a.m. and told that my house had burned down, and my library, which is a separate building. I have a studio that I work in. As it turned out, it had not happened. Everybody's house except for mine had burned down. Although there was a lot of damage, and so it was a terrifying moment. I have since taken this building that I have, and I built a sort of a double gravel path with a stone wall that will stop any fire coming up the hill. So, the house didn't burn down, the studio didn't burn down, because we were very careful about the trees, about cropping all the vegetation around it. And that's why, although everything else got burned down, these two structures survived. But in California, especially in Sonoma County, you have to take it seriously. I know several people with great archival collections who lost everything. Oh. Now, on a more daily basis, every window here has been treated to take out sunlight and take out ultraviolet radiation. I have shades that I bring down when I'm not in here, so it's full of light when I'm here, but it gets quite dark when I'm not here. And when I go away, I drape all of the shelves with sheets. When the studio was full of smoke, but because I had everything sheeted, the books did not pick up the smoke. So that obsessive little habit. Then finally, I have 2 closed closets, which I keep the most valuable books so that they're not in sunlight at all. I think you can become too crazy about this. Oh, yeah. Part of them is just keep them neat in rows and treat them nicely. I can read a book, and my kids make fun of me. I can read a paperback, and you'll never know that anybody read it, because I'm very careful about these things. But I think if you have very valuable books, you owe it to posterity to preserve them, because it means they're rare. It means they're considered precious. And so, while not being nutty about it, I try to be very fastidious, try to be careful.
Thank you.
That's the practical advice.
Yes, thank you both for the very practical advice. So one final question. If you could both maybe comment about your appreciation for small presses, which have published, Dana, some of your books and broadsides, both as an author and a collector, and perhaps as a dealer, Ernie, the value of fine printing and small presses.
Sure. Well, I'm also published by small presses, and small presses will take on things that are either not of broad enough interest to be profitable for a larger publisher, or simply are otherwise neglected. And so they're very important. We have seen in the last 40 or 50 years what people call a media concentration, which we see when a company that owns television stations or movie studios also owns publishers like Viacom does. Fox or News America, which owns Fox, also owns News America Publishing, which is HarperCollins and everything HarperCollins owns. So when you become part of a big publicly owned corporation, the book really needs to sell a lot and have a very broad and quick appeal. Small presses historically have taken risks on people that there was no market for yet at all. In the case of the modernists, in the earlier 20th century, they created the market because you look at the small print runs of the hundreds, or usually definitely no more than 1,000 of books that are now universally acknowledged, like Proofrock and Other Observations, and the first Langston Hughes books, things like this. These are household names now, really. But there was no one interested in buying them. So, and even then, some of these things like Harmonium by Wallace Stevens took years and years and years to sell out a very small first printing. So they serve a purpose in predicting the future, for one thing, by giving space or giving air to breathe, oxygen to a movement or a group, a school that doesn't have commercial appeal. So that's very important. And then from a rare book, so I'm thankful that I'm published by them, and I read many, many books from small presses. But as a result, because the print runs are so small and often the material's not of the best quality, and no one cared about it at the time, and then you go 50 years, 100 years down the road, everyone does care, they become very scarce. And so those are the very things, the combination of how important someone became from how small the beginnings were, makes those early books, the first editions, artifacts that are very, very valuable because they're scarce. The demand is high. They are considered very important historically and critically, but there was no audience for it at the time they did it. They took a chance, and then it happened. And you see this with also the Hogarth Press. Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard basically created a press to publish themselves and their friends. And Vanessa Bell, her sister, did the dust jacket design, and they printed them themselves at first in their house. So they created a market for themselves. So that's what I have to say about small presses, because big publishers are no different than big movie studios or big record companies. They want to keep repeating the last big thing that happened, and they don't know how it happened. So they just keep creating thinner and thinner simulacra of something that did magically take off and change things. So I'll stop talking and let Dana, who is truly an expert on this subject, talk about small presses.
Well, no, I agree with everything you're saying, Ernie. I would maybe take one step further, into this with talking about fine presses. Fine presses are sort of the indie filmmakers of American poetry. They are the people who discover the new talent, do the projects that wouldn't necessarily be commercially viable. And so I think of Harry Duncan at the Cummington Press, Kim Merker at Stonewall Press, Michael Pike at Aurelia Press, all of the Grabhorns, in San Francisco, Gabriel Richard Rummans of Exopedia and Plain Rappers Press. These are absolutely significant cultural figures in the history of American poetry. I mean, this little book by Weldon Keys that I had, this is a Colt Press book, which means that it's published by Jane Grabhorn. So when the two Grabhorn men didn't want to do this, she continued publishing. She published Keys, she published Janet Lewis, she published Edmund Wilson, in these wonderful books. So I love them because they're beautiful, they are historically significant, and I think there's a special pleasure about reading a book of poems that's 8 pages long, where all the 8 poems are meant to be read together, versus reading one that's 70 pages long, which is kind of a omnium gatherum of whatever the writer was doing at that point. So I have a large collection of fine press books, and I love them. They're my favorite books to sort of hold and look at and reread.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think Brad is maybe going to come back in and join us for a quick goodbye.
No, yes. Thank you both. That was a fantastic conversation. Enjoyed it a lot. Really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. And thank you all to the attendees who joined us this evening.